13th of June, 2020, Nokomis, Illinois. A 108-year-old Australian tractor crosses the auction block at Almond Auctions and sells to an American collector for $283,500. It is the McDonald Imperial EB number 140. Built in 1912 at the Richmond works of A.H. McDonald and Company. 4 years earlier, in 1908, a 25-year-old Melbourne engineer named Alfred Henry McDonald had built the first internal combustion tractor ever assembled on Australian soil. Across Australia, in every farm shed from Werribee to the Mallee, in every retired single-cylinder engine still ticking in a country garage, in every photograph of a father at the wheel of a hot bulb diesel, the Imperial is still there. The factory was not bombed, not raided, not betrayed by foreign hands. The country that built it just forgot. Australia was first to build it, then Australia forgot it ever did. Chapter 1. The Workshop, Flinders Street, Melbourne, 1903. A small mechanical workshop opens its doors. 2 brothers, 1 engineer's bench, a handful of hand tools, a forge, a coal-fired furnace. Alfred Henry McDonald is 20 years old. Born 1883. His brother Ernest John McDonald is 17. Born 1886. They have no inherited capital, no university degree, no factory behind them. They have an idea about engines, and they have decided to build a company around it. The product they choose is unfashionable. 1903, Melbourne is a gas-lit city. The street lamps burn coal gas. The kitchens burn wood. The factories run on steam, vertical boilers, piston-driven crankshafts, leather drive belts running across overhead shafts. The Australian colonies have just become a federation. Electricity has arrived but is barely deployed. The McDonalds decide to build petrol engines specifically to drive electric lighting generators. Here's the thing. In 1903 Melbourne, this is approximately the most advanced commercial product anyone is making in the country. A small petrol engine that turns a small dynamo, that produces direct current, that runs a small string of incandescent bulbs. It is the kind of thing the City of London is buying. It is not the kind of thing the City of Melbourne is making. The brothers do it anyway. Within a year, they outgrow the Flinders Street workshop and move to larger premises in Hawthorn. The product expands. By around 1905, they have launched a brand name for the gasoline and kerosene stationary engines coming off the bench. Imperial. The name will outlast the company. The name will outlast Alfred Henry McDonald himself. The name will be on the head stamp of every machine they will build for the next 82 years. It is the kind of brand a man chooses when he believes his firm will rule the Southern Hemisphere. In 1905, that belief is presumptuous. By the early 1920s, it will be accurate. The early Imperial engines are stationary. They sit on a concrete pad. They drive a flat belt that drives a pump, a saw bench, a chaff cutter, a butter churn, an electric generator. They are sold to farmers, to small workshops, to country bakers and country dairies. The McDonalds become the engine maker the farms of Victoria can actually afford. We do not know exactly how many of these earliest Imperial engines were built. The company records from the first 5 years have not survived to any accessible archive. What we know is that by 1907, the brothers had decided their next move. The next move was to take the engine off the concrete pad and put it on wheels. Read that again. 2 brothers in their 20s, with no inherited fortune, in a city that mostly still ran on horses, decided to build a self-propelled internal combustion agricultural machine and sell it to Australian farmers. 5 years later, in 1908, Alfred Henry McDonald did something no Australian had done before. He fitted one of his Imperial engines to a 4-wheel chassis. Chapter 2. 1908. The Hawthorn Works. Alfred Henry McDonald is 25 years old. On the shop floor sits a four-wheel steel chassis, drop-forged frame rails, cast-iron wheel hubs, spoked steel road wheels, a driver's seat at the back, a steering column up front, a long bonnet that opens forward. Where the engine should be is a hole. Onto the chassis goes a D-type twin-cylinder Imperial engine, 20 horsepower, kerosene-fueled, coil ignition, hand-cranked starter. The engine fires, the driver climbs onto the seat, the clutch engages, the four wheels turn under their own power on Australian soil for the first time in this country's history. It is the McDonald Imperial oil tractor, model designation EA, the first internal combustion tractor ever assembled in Australia. A note on that claim: Australia had seen tractors before 1908. The English Ivel agricultural motor had reached a Tasmanian orchardist around 1903. McDonald was not first in the country. McDonald was first built in the country. We will say this precisely every time it comes up. The distinction matters. But the precise claim is still extraordinary. In 1908, only a handful of countries on Earth were building internal combustion tractors: the United States, Britain, Germany, France on its own, and, in a small Hawthorn workshop, Australia. Add to the list an Australian workshop employing roughly half a dozen men that had just put the Southern Hemisphere on the world tractor map. Read that again. While most of the country was still ploughing with horses, while most of the world's farms had never heard the sound of a piston engine, Alfred Henry McDonald and his brother were assembling by hand with hand-poured castings a four-wheel, two-cylinder, kerosene-fired agricultural machine. The sophistication is the surprise. Dr. Ian Coates, curator at the National Museum of Australia, has put it on the record. The remarkable thing about the early McDonald tractors, he writes, was the relative sophistication of the engineering: coil ignition, a 3-speed gearbox, automotive rack and pinion steering, reflecting Alfred McDonald's capacity to improve on the imported American designs of the day. Coil ignition, 3-speed gearbox, rack and pinion steering, in 1908. 4 years before the first Ford Model T arrived in Australia. The EA is not a peasant machine. The EA is an engineered machine. Around 1910, A.H. McDonald and Company moves again. Out of Hawthorn, across the Yarra, into a purpose-built factory and foundry at the Richmond Works. The address will become the spiritual centre of the operation for the next 75 years. The Imperial stationary engine line moves there. The tractor line moves there. The road roller line, which is about to begin, moves there. By 1912, the Richmond foundry is pouring its own iron. The next tractor is on the bench. The EB is the second-generation production tractor, heavier, stronger, gear-changeable, on the move. The first EB rolls out of Richmond in 1912. 4 years after 1908, Alfred Henry McDonald shipped the second-generation tractor to a farmer on an island in Western Port Bay. The trip required a police escort. Chapter 3. Number 140. The buyer's name was Frank William Chilcott. He owned a 403-acre farm called Lillersden Park on French Island, in Western Port Bay, southeast of Melbourne. He had recently received an inheritance. He decided to spend a substantial portion of it on a single machine. The machine was the McDonald Imperial EB, serial number 140. The EB was the second-generation McDonald tractor, the production version that followed the 1908 EA prototype. Twin-cylinder, vertical engine, 6¼ bore, 3 forward speeds, 1 reverse. Around 5 tonnes, though the surviving records disagree on the exact weight. Around 20 horsepower, kerosene-fueled. Coil ignition, rack and pinion steering. Designed by Alfred Henry McDonald, age 29. Influenced, as he openly acknowledged, by the British Saunderson and the American Hart-Parr Big Four, but built and engineered in Richmond on Australian iron with Australian cast components. The Australasian magazine reviewed the EB in 1912. The verdict: the EB could do ploughing, cultivating and hauling at a saving of from 25 to 50% on horses. A working farmer reading that in 1912, when the cost of feeding a horse team was the largest single expense on most Victorian farms, would have understood it as a revolution. Frank Chilcott bought it. Getting it home was the problem. The EB had to be loaded onto a horse-drawn dray at the Richmond works. The dray crossed Melbourne under police escort, not because the cargo was valuable, though it was, but because nothing this size, this noisy, this strange, had moved through the streets of inner Melbourne before. Crowds gathered. Horses bolted. A constable rode at the head of the procession, clearing the road. At Hastings, the EB was rolled onto a barge. The barge crossed Western Port Bay and landed on the French island foreshore. The tractor was rolled off and driven under its own power toward Lillisden Park. It came up over a hill outside the farmhouse. Garth Bennett's, a small boy, was Frank Chilcott's nephew. He was at the farmhouse the day the tractor arrived. He heard the engine first, a low, irregular thump-thump that no animal makes, and then he saw the silhouette crest the rise. 2 long bonnet pipes, tall steel wheels, a man sitting up on a metal seat where no man on French Island had ever sat. Garth Bennett's ran inside the house, climbed the stairs, and hid under his bed. Let that number sit for a moment. The first reaction of a French island child to Australia's first locally built tractor was fear. EB number 140 became part of the farm. After Frank Chilcott died in 1919, his brother-in-law Richard Bennett's took over the tractor and worked it for decades. It is one of only a handful of EBs that will survive into the next century. We will come back to it. The story of number 140 is not over yet. By 1918, Alfred McDonald had built the engine that would carry his name for the next 32 years. Chapter 4. The Engine Empire. The super diesel launched in 1918. Single-cylinder, hot bulb compression ignition, heavy cast iron flywheel, slow revving. The small ones turned at around 600 revolutions per minute, the big ones at 400. Designed for a working life measured in decades, not years. Built to be repaired by a country mechanic with a hammer, a vise, and a single drum of injection oil. The injection system was licensed from the St. Mary's Machine Company of Ohio. The Bronze Vid system, named for the Dutch and Danish engineers who patented it. McDonald paid the license and built the rest themselves at Richmond. 8 sizes, from 2 horsepower to 20 horsepower. Sold to farms, sawmills, dairies, generating stations, coastal townships without grid electricity, country bakeries, country breweries, country garages. Between 1918 and 1950, McDonald built almost 13,000 of them. Read that again. 13,000 individual engines, hand-assembled, cast in the McDonald foundry at Richmond. Sold across Australia and New Zealand. Across 32 years. The single most successful model in the range. The SE type accounted for 3,338 units on its own. 3,338 examples of one Australian-designed industrial engine. There is no comparable Australian stationary engine. McDonald, by 1920, owned the small engine market of the Southern Hemisphere. And the Richmond Works was not just the engine factory. By the early 1920s, A.H. McDonald and Company became the first Australian firm to manufacture simultaneously tractors, petrol-engined road rollers and diesel-engined road rollers. 3 industrial categories, 1 foundry, 1 workforce. In Australia, no other firm came close. In the Southern Hemisphere, no other firm existed. The location was the Richmond Works, Bridge Road, Richmond. The showrooms ran along the street frontage at numbers 566 to 574. The factory and foundry sat behind. The exact site boundaries are slightly contested in surviving sources. Different documents reference Bridge Road, Stowell Street and Burnley. But the operational footprint was concentrated at the Richmond works through every decade of the company's existence. Alfred Henry McDonald was 35 years old in 1918. His brother Ernest was 32. They had been in business 15 years. The workshop on Flinders Street had become an industrial operation with a working foundry, a machine shop, an assembly hall, and a sales operation. Let that number sit for a moment. 3 men in 1903, a national industrial brand by 1920. But here is the thing nobody at Richmond could yet see. In 1917, while Alfred Henry McDonald was finalising the super diesel design, a different machine had been launched 8,000 miles away in Dearborn, Michigan. Henry Ford had moved his Model T mass production engineering into a new product category, light, unit-frame, 4-cylinder tractor designed for the smallest American family farm. Within 2 years, the first example of that machine reached Australia. And by the time the super diesel launched, a 4-wheel grey machine had arrived at the Tarrant Motor Company in Melbourne. It had 3 letters on its radiator: Ford. Chapter 5. The Fordson Lands. The Fordson Model F entered American mass production in 1917. Henry Ford was 54 years old. He had already revolutionised the automobile with the Model T and the moving assembly line. He had been thinking about the farm tractor for almost a decade. The Fordson was the result. Light. Around 1,200 kilograms, less than a quarter of the EB's weight. 4-cylinder, unit frame construction. No separate chassis. The engine block was the frame. The transmission housing was structural, built to be assembled at industrial volumes on a moving line by unskilled labour. Henry Ford's stated price target, $395 US. Read that again. $395 US for a complete 4-wheel, 4-cylinder agricultural tractor. Imported into Australia, the retail price ran higher. The exact Australian retail figure has not been recovered from surviving sources, but the unit cost coming out of the Dearborn plant was $395 US. The McDonald EB cost more than a Melbourne terrace house. The Fordson cost less than a sewing machine. Between 1917 and 1928, Henry Ford built roughly 700,000 Fordsons. 700,000. Over the same decade, Alfred Henry McDonald built tractors in the low hundreds. The first Australian Fordson agency was the Tarrant Motor Company in Melbourne, distributors of Ford automobiles since the Model T era. The first Fordson tractor was entered in the Werribee tractor trials in September 1919. Victorian farmers stood at the edge of the demonstration field and watched a machine that ploughed at a fraction of the running cost of any McDonald. In 1926, Ford Australia opened its own assembly operation at Geelong. The Fordson was no longer an import. It was being assembled in Victoria from kits shipped from Dearborn. The villain, and Henry Ford was the villain, was now operating from a factory 80 kilometres from Richmond. Here's the kicker. Henry Ford did not build a better tractor than the McDonald Imperial. The McDonald EB had Coil ignition, a 3-speed gearbox, automotive rack and pinion steering. The Fordson had none of those. The Fordson was crude. The Fordson was hot. The Fordson tipped over backwards on hills when ploughing, a documented design flaw that killed American farmers in its early years. The Fordson did not win on engineering. The Fordson won on price. It would win on price for the next 60 years. And the McDonald boardroom in Richmond knew it. For 3 years, from 1917 to 1920, McDonald tried to compete. Refinements to the EB, cost-down engineering, new chassis tooling. None of it moved the unit price within reach of the Fordson. The Imperial Super Diesel kept the company solvent. The road roller line kept growing, but the tractor business, the business that had defined the McDonald name in 1908, was in collapse. By 1920, Alfred Henry McDonald's company had made a decision that would have been unimaginable in 1908. They stopped building tractors. Before we get to the surrender, hit subscribe. The next 6 chapters are the part of this story almost no Australian under 60 has ever been told. The part where the first Australian tractor maker became a tractor importer with its own name on someone else's product. The part where the war years are a documented archival silence. And the part where the man who built the first one died too soon to ever see his own name disappear. Subscribe before you scroll. Chapter 6. The Surrender. In 1920, Alfred Henry McDonald stopped building tractors. The company that had assembled the first internal combustion tractor on Australian soil in 1908, that had shipped the EB to Frank Chilcott under police escort in 1912, closed its tractor line at Richmond. In its place, McDonald did something that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. They became an importer. From 1920 to 1929, the McDonald showrooms at Bridge Road, Richmond, sold tractors that had not been built there. 2 product lines. The first was the Emerson-Brantingham, a 4-cylinder tractor built at Rockford, Illinois. The second was the Avance, a Swedish-built single-cylinder hot bulb tractor manufactured at Stockholm. Both arrived in Melbourne in crates. Both were assembled and finished at Richmond. Both were sold under a McDonald branded badge. And this is where it gets genuinely insane. The first Australian tractor manufacturer had become a tractor importer. The company, whose 1908 prototype was on the engineering record as the third country achievement of internal combustion farm mechanisation, was now selling Swedish and American machines with its own name on the radiator shield. Read that again. McDonald was selling tractors. The tractors were made in Rockford, Illinois. The tractors were made in Stockholm, Sweden. The McDonald name on the front of them was the only Australian thing about them. Alfred Henry McDonald was 37 years old when the surrender began. He was 46 when it ended. The man who had built the first one watched, across an entire decade of his prime, his own life's work become a sales catalogue for someone else's design. The super diesel kept the company solvent. The Richmond Engine Works ran every weekday, building the same hot bulb stationary engines, sending them out to the same country dairies and country sawmills and country bakeries that had bought them in 1918. The road roller business kept growing. McDonald petrol rollers and diesel rollers became standard equipment for municipal councils across Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia. But the tractor primacy was gone. At Richmond, the EB patterns went onto the racks above the casting floor. They would gather dust for 9 years. In 1926, the situation got worse. Ford Australia opened its assembly plant at Geelong. The Fordson was no longer something a Melbourne dealer imported in crates from Dearborn. The Fordson was being assembled in Victoria by Australian workers at industrial volumes. The villain was now headquartered in the same state, 80 kilometres from Richmond. By 1929, the Avance and Emerson-Brantingham contracts were not paying enough to justify continuing the import business. McDonald wound them down. The decade of surrender ended. Alfred Henry McDonald, age 46, made the decision to resume domestic tractor manufacture at Richmond. He had a new design, a new gearbox, a new engine concept. He believed, he had to believe, that the McDonald name could mean something on a tractor again. In 1930, Alfred Henry McDonald built his first locally made tractor in 9 years. He called it the TWB. Chapter 7. The Comeback That Wasn't. The TWB launched at the Richmond Works in 1930. Single cylinder. Hot bulb semi-diesel, around 35 horsepower. Gearbox parts derived, under licence and through engineering compromise, from the American Rumilly oil pull range. Heavy, simple, slow revving, repairable. Designed to do what the Fordson could not, handle Australian conditions, Australian acreage, Australian heat. Production records preserved by the company historian Kenneth McDonald survive in fragments. The earliest known serial is 73 TWB, dated 1931. The latest is TWB 879, dated 1944. Roughly 600 TWBs were built before the war, roughly 800 by 1944. Across a 13-year production run, McDonald built fewer tractors than Henry Ford built in a single week. Read that again. McDonald, across 13 years, built fewer tractors than Ford built in a week. The Depression hit Australia in late 1929. Wheat prices collapsed. Wool prices collapsed. The agricultural sector, the McDonald customer, went into the worst contraction in living memory. Australian farmers who might have bought a TWB into 28 could not afford one in 932. Australian farmers who could afford a tractor at all bought the cheaper imported one. Meanwhile, in Geelong, Ford Australia was assembling Fordsons by the thousand. Through the 1930s, the firm shifted to the all-new Fordson N, a heavier, more powerful machine that filled the size gap where the McDonald TWB had been trying to compete. By 1939, the imported tractor share of the Australian market was a comfortable majority. The McDonald share, in the same period, was a rounding error. Here is the thing that should have been a turning point and was not. In Western Australia, after the war, a different Australian engineer would attempt what McDonald had attempted. His name was Alan Hawker Chamberlain, Bob Chamberlain to his trade, and he would found Chamberlain Industries at Welshpool in 1949, the Chamberlain 40K and its post-war successors, built for Australian conditions, lasted to 1986. Bob Chamberlain was awarded the CBE in 1971. Chamberlain succeeded where McDonald could not. Not because Chamberlain was a better engineer, Alfred Henry McDonald was, by any technical measure, his equal. But Chamberlain founded his firm after the war, when the Australian government was actively protecting domestic manufacturers and when import tariffs were briefly favourable. McDonald had founded his 30 years earlier, into the teeth of the Fordson era, into a tariff regime that quietly favoured imports. Out on French Island, none of this mattered. EB number 140 was still in the Bennett's family, still working the chicory crop, still firing on the same Coil ignition twin-cylinder Imperial engine. Through the Depression, through the 1930s, through the years when its makers, 80 kilometres north at Richmond, were building tractors in the hundreds and watching imports outsell them 10 to 1. The first Australian-built tractor was still ploughing every day. The factory that made it was shrinking. By 1939, the EB had been ploughing French Island for 27 years. The Richmond foundry had begun to forget that it ever made tractors. On the 3rd of September 1939, Australia went to war, and at the Richmond works, the engines did not stop. Chapter 8. The Documented Gap. 3rd of September 1939, Australia declared war on Germany. At Richmond, the engines did not stop. The super diesel line at the Richmond works kept running through the war years. Surviving examples in the museum's Victoria collection are dated as late as 1944. The SE type, super diesel, the most successful Australian-designed stationary engine, was still being assembled and shipped from the Richmond foundry, while Australian troops were fighting in North Africa, the Pacific and the European theatre. The TWB tractor line kept running too. The production record shows serial TWB 879 dated to 1944. The Richmond machine shop did not shut down. What it built for the war effort. That is where the record goes quiet. We have to be honest here, because the Lost Legacy Ledger has previously failed on this exact category of claim. The McDonald Richmond works during the Second World War is, in the currently accessible archives, a documented gap. No primary or authoritative source confirms that McDonald held contracts with the Australian Department of Munitions. No source documents gun mount production. No source documents Bofors components, shells, tank parts, marine diesel propulsion for the Royal Australian Navy, or aircraft sub-assemblies for the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. None of these appears in the museum's Victoria records, the National Museum entries, the trade press, or the Kenneth McDonald history. This is not the same as saying it did not happen. It is saying the archives have not yet answered the question. What we know from public record is that another Richmond engineering firm, Chas Ruwalt Proprietary Limited, completed its 1,000th 25-pounder gun on the 9th of May, 1944. Ruwalt is documented. Ruwalt did the gun work. McDonald may have done other war work. The two firms were neighbours. They were not the same firm. Read that again. Australia's first tractor company kept its lights on through the war. What it built for the war effort is a question the archives have not yet answered. We will not invent the answer to fill the gap. Here is the honest statement. The Richmond engine works ran throughout the Second World War. The super diesel kept being built. The TWB kept being built. The workforce was not stood down. The factory was not requisitioned. Whether the Australian government bought from McDonald between 1939 and 1945. The documents will tell us when someone gets to them. The Kenneth McDonald book, A. H. McDonald Industrial Pioneer, published in 1988 by a descendant of the founder, contains production records the public archives do not. The National Archives of Australia's Department of Munitions contract files have not been fully digitised. There is work still to be done. For now, the engines did not stop. The tractors did not stop. The men in the Richmond machine shop kept their jobs through the war. When the war ended in 1945, Alfred Henry McDonald was 62 years old. He had one more tractor to build. Chapter 9. 20. Tractors. The T6 Superdrive launched at Richmond in 1946. Single-cylinder, two-stroke semi-diesel, 9¼ bore, 10-inch stroke, 48 horsepower at the belt, 29 at the drawbar, 600 revolutions per minute, 5 forward gears, 2 reverse, chain drive independent power takeoff, the most sophisticated tractor McDonald had ever built. 8,064 pounds of cast iron and steel, painted Imperial green, with the McDonald name and the model designation cast in raised letters on the radiator shield. It was beautiful. It was capable. It was Alfred Henry McDonald's last great act of engineering at age 63. The retail price was 2,200 Australian pounds. Across the same showroom floor in 1946, a brand new grey Ferguson TE20 was selling for roughly a fifth of the McDonald price. The post-war Fordson Major and the Massey Harris ploughing tractor both retailed at less than half. £2,200 against tractors selling for under 500, 4 times the price. The number of T6 superdrives built between 1946 and 1955 was approximately 20. Read that again. The factory that built Australia's first tractor in 1908. The factory that built 13,000 super diesel engines, 600 TWBS and hundreds of road rollers, built exactly 20 superdrives in the entire post-war era. Some sources add a further 11 T6C variants. Even on the most generous reading, the total run is 31, hand-finished, hand-painted. Each one took weeks to assemble. Each one was the work of a craftsman in a factory whose competitors had moved their tractors onto a moving assembly line in another country. 20 tractors, 9 years. Let that number sit for a moment. The first Australian tractor maker, in the decade when Australian agriculture mechanised at the fastest rate in its history, built 2 units a year. The economics were impossible. The grey Ferguson was lighter, easier, cheaper, and backed by Massey Ferguson's global dealer network. The imported British and American tractors flooding into post-war Australia outnumbered the McDonald T6 by a ratio of 1,000 to 1. The McDonald name still meant something to old farmers who remembered the EB and the TWB. But old farmers did not buy new tractors. Their sons did. In 1955, the last McDonald tractor came off the Richmond line. It was not a ceremony. There was no announcement in the trade press. The works simply assembled the final T6, painted it, shipped it, and that was the end of 47 years of McDonald tractor production, from the 1908 EA to the 1955 T6. The company did not die. The Richmond works kept building road rollers, Imperial badged, McDonald engineered, sold to councils across Australia and New Zealand. The super diesel engine line continued. The foundry kept pouring. The McDonald name kept appearing on equipment leaving the Bridge Road shipping bay, but the tractor business, the business Alfred Henry McDonald had created in 1908 at age 25, was over. He was 72 years old. Chapter 10. The Slow Forgetting. For 30 years after the last McDonald tractor, the company did not die. It just slowly stopped being McDonald. The Richmond works kept building road rollers, petrol-engined, diesel-engined, painted Imperial green, shipped to municipal councils from Cairns to Hobart to Perth. The McDonald road roller remained standard equipment for Australian Council road resurfacing crews through the 1950s, the 1960s and into the 1970s. If you grew up in Australia between 1955 and 1980 and ever saw a road being patched, the chances are high that you saw a McDonald roller doing the work. But the tractor heritage faded. The 1908 primacy faded. By the early 1960s, the McDonald name was associated, in the public mind, with road maintenance equipment. Not with Alfred Henry McDonald. Not with 1908. Not with the first Australian-built tractor. Ernest John McDonald died in 1956, age 70. Alfred Henry McDonald died in 1963, age 80. By then, the trade had largely forgotten that he was the man who built Australia's first tractor. In 1969, A.H. McDonald and Company Proprietary Limited merged with Jacques Brothers Proprietary Limited. Jacques was the long-established Melbourne engineering and rock-crushing firm founded by Edward Jacques in 1888. Edward Jacques and his brother Wallace had registered the partnership in 1917. The company had become a public company in 1949. By 1969, Jacques was looking to consolidate its construction equipment portfolio, and McDonald, with its road roller line and its diesel engine line and its Richmond foundry, was a clean fit. The McDonald name disappeared as a public brand after the merger. In 1973, the merged entity became Jacques Limited. In 1979, Clyde Industries took over Jacques. In 1985, the last McDonald pedigree road roller was built, 82 years after Alfred Henry McDonald and his brother Ernest had opened the workshop on Flinders Street. There was no announcement. There was no closing ceremony. The last roller went out the gate at the Richmond Works, and that was the end of the McDonald Imperial industrial brand. Here's the thing the record actually shows, against what trade folklore has sometimes claimed. McDonald was not absorbed by International Harvester in 1957. McDonald did not die in 1957. McDonald died across 30 years, slowly, by attrition, in the wake of its founder's death. And the final corporate event was the 1969 Jacques Chaudière, not the foreign villain absorption that would have made the story cleaner. The Richmond Works site itself, the original 570 to 574 Bridge Road address, the showrooms and the foundry, has been redeveloped beyond easy recognition. Current 2026 occupants and use of the precise site are not verified in the public record. Bridge Road today carries a McDonald's fast food outlet, entirely unrelated to A.H. McDonald and Company. The confusion is a trap for the unwary. On the 13th of June 2020, in a town called Nokomis, Illinois, EB number 140 crossed an auction block. Chapter 11. 113 years. 13th of June 2020, Oman Auctions, Nokomis, Illinois. The auctioneer raises the gavel. A 108-year-old four-wheel kerosene tractor sits under the lights. McDonald Imperial EB, serial number 140. The same machine Frank Chilcott bought new in 1912. The same machine Garth Bennett's hid from as a boy. The same machine the Bennett's family worked on French Island for the better part of a century. Sold to an American collector. Hammer price file $283,500 US. The Australian Agricultural Press picks up the story within 48 hours. Australian collectors invoke the Movable Cultural Heritage Act. An anonymous Melbourne benefactor and the National Cultural Heritage Account secure the funding. In 2021, the National Museum of Australia acquires EB number 140 for $250,000. From the 15th of May to the 23rd of July 2023, the EB sits on the central plinth of the Gandel Atrium in Canberra, 113 years after Alfred Henry McDonald built the first one in 1908. Lesson 1. Primacy is not memory. Australia built its own tractor in 1908. The achievement is engraved on no plaque, taught in no school, named on no street. Primacy and memory are different things. One is what happened, the other is what survived. Lesson 2. The cheaper machine wins. Henry Ford did not build a better tractor than the McDonald Imperial. The EB had coil ignition, a 3-speed gearbox, rack and pinion steering. The Fordson had none. The Fordson won on price, $395 US, against a machine that cost more than a house. Every Australian manufacturing collapse since has been a variation on the same equation. Lesson 3. The maker outlived the making. Alfred Henry McDonald built Australia's first tractor in 1908 at age 25. He stopped building tractors in 1955 at age 72. He died in 1963, having outlived his own life's work by 8 years. The man who built the first tractor lived long enough to forget it himself. A school group walks through the Gandel Atrium of the National Museum of Australia in Canberra, say autumn 2026. The EB number 140 is on the central plinth. A boy in a grey uniform asks the teacher what the machine is. The teacher reads the plaque. The boy asks who built it. The teacher does not know. There is no statue of Alfred Henry McDonald. There is no plaque on the Richmond works. There is no Alfred Henry McDonald Drive in Richmond. There is no Imperial Lane on French Island. There is no Founders' Day. There is just one tractor, in one room, in one museum. The country that built it is still here. The memory is somewhere else.